Order. I call to order today's House of Commons Defence Committee evidence session. In fact, it's our final session on UK's contribution to European security. It's our ministerial session, and that's why it gives me great pleasure to once again welcome the Minister for the Armed Forces, Luke Pollard MP. We also have with us Paul Wyatt, the Director General for Policy at the Ministry of Defence, and we have with us Jim Carter, the Director General for Commercial and Industry at the Ministry of Defence. It's also a pleasure to welcome Air Vice Marshal Mark Fluin, the Assistant Chief of Defence Staff for Military Strategy at the Ministry of Defence. A very, very warm welcome to your good selves, and thank you for taking the time out to help inform our committee's inquiry into UK's contribution to European security. And without further ado, gents, if we can get on with the question. I know we've got a fully packed 2-hour session. There are various areas that we need to cover. So my request, Minister, to yourself and your colleagues would be if we can make the responses as concise as possible, and no doubt members will be just as concise with questions. But to kickstart us off, if we can have Ian Room, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Minister, NATO is mentioned over 180 times throughout the SD, and it's like the golden thread through everything that we're doing. Are we really truly committed to the principle of NATO first for our personnel? And I say this because if we are, when we will recognise and actively promote NATO service as a career-enhancing opportunity rather than allowing it to be perceived as a barrier to rapid promotion within our own armed forces.
Good morning. Yes, NATO First is an absolute golden thread throughout the Strategic Defence Review, and deliberately so. It has been very clear that we are focusing on the Euro-Atlantic area as our primary area of concern, and that's why the SDR does rightly contain a lot of NATO. But you will note from the SDR also contains a commitment to put our people at the heart of defence policy. Some of that relates to how we look after our people, and that there's lots of focus on how we look after our people at home, improving defence housing, for instance. But some of our people serving abroad don't always get the support that we think they had deserved in the past. It's one of the reasons that one of our early announcements was about increasing childcare support for those people deployed abroad, and making it more attractive to be deployed abroad. Now, one of the bits that the SDR also sets out is an ambition that to attain a senior rank within the Ministry of Defence, we want to create an expectation that you should have had an overseas deployment, and ideally at NATO. The idea behind that is to build familiarity with NATO structures, our NATO allies, how we cooperate and work together on an international basis. So then when we say NATO first, we actually incentivise that so our high flyers want to get a NATO posting, and it's not as sometimes can be the case or regarded as the case where it's a cul-de-sac for a career, because the people we have at NATO are absolutely first class, and as a government we're placing more emphasis on those roles. The UK has a low vacancy rate at NATO compared to many of our European allies. We want to see all those roles filled, obviously. To do that, we need to make service at NATO more attractive, both for the offer, but also clearer about where that sits in someone's career trajectory. And that's why setting the expectation early doors that advancement needs to have international roles, especially at NATO, is a key part of that.
Yeah, so what steps are actually being taken to ensure that serving with NATO is seen as an asset for promotion, professional development and leadership, and that it's properly valued for promotion and career progression decisions? Because sometimes there's not so many high-ranking officers in all the services that spent a great deal of time in their career in NATO. They may have just have done like a little 3-month tour or something like that. But a lot of the high-ranking officers throughout all 3 services have not really, committed a lot of their career within NATO. And I sometimes get the feeling, after our visit to Ramstein as well, is that actually it's seen as a sidestep, mainly maybe because it's left to other foreign higher ranking officers to write their appraisals or whatever. But I'm just thinking, how can we change that mind step, and what steps are we saying to actively say, if you're deployed to NATO, it's like a zigzagging approach, if you like, that actually it's enhancing your career and you won't be below your counterparts for promotion. I don't know if the Air Marshal, Vice Marshal would like to say something on this, because you most probably have this from some of your colleagues.
If I perhaps just give the headline and as the AVMs come in. So setting the ambition and setting the clear direction in the SDR is a really important part of signalling to the entire system and to our people that a career at NATO is going to be more valued than it has been in the past. And as part of that, as we look at implementing defence reform across all aspects of defence, including in the MSHQ, being clear to the career managers, effectively that are the people that look after where do you go next in your career, that we are valuing NATO roles more. It's an important part, but I think you shouldn't underestimate how the offer is an important part of that, because if the offer is not right for our people, especially those people with younger families for whom the childcare, as an example, was something that's not right, or as we know, for some of our personnel deploying into European Union-based roles since Brexit, it's been harder for their partners to find work because they're outside the permissions that were set by that Brexit deal. We know that limits and constrains some of that. So the focus that we're having in saying these are important roles, we are going to value them more, and we have a deliberate policy of improving the offer. We've made some steps on that. There's more to do. I think is an important part of kind of bringing that commitment to life.
I think just reinforcing the Minister's point, clearly NATO has been the bedrock of European security for over 75 years now. We're very well represented across NATO, both in MARCOM, LANDCOM and AIRCOM. Actually, to your point on senior officers, we're very well represented at the highest level in the Navy and the Air Force in terms of AIRCOM. To your specific question, the Defence's People's Area has taken the SDR, looked at the people work strands and is working that through now. Looking at NATO and how we make sure that career path is catered for is one of those work strands, and that work is underway out of SCR.
Thank you very much. I believe Derek Twigg wanted to come in on this particular point as well.
Just a quick point. We went to Joint Force Command at Norfolk recently, which was a very interesting visit, and the previous guys of the committee went to Naples. And what came off at the visits was there was some concern expressed about the vacancies that were being carried. Now, you know from a recent parliamentary question, there are actually 80 vacancies that exist the UK should be filling. So I just wonder how you square that with the NATO First policy with over 80 vacancies, of which some are very important positions as well.
I think if I recall the PQ that I replied to, I think it was yourself on that matter, I think that's 8.6% or something like that.
Yeah, but when you say 80, it sounds a bit different than 8.6, doesn't it?
It certainly does, but that's why it's important to have the 80 number and the 8.6% alongside each other, because what that demonstrates is that the vast majority of our NATO roles are filled, and the breakdown of roles that we fill them at, and indeed when I looked at the figures of the breakdown about just how many roles have been gapped for some time, well, if a role has been gapped for 5 years, then that's not a proper full role because the system has adapted to be able to deliver without it. So I think there's a conversation around how we make sure that the people we assign to NATO roles are the right people, are the ones that we can get benefit for themselves and the nation out of. We want to fill more of those roles, and part of that is about, I think, making NATO roles more attractive for people's careers. And I think if you look at the breakdown of roles, it's not at the senior level where most of those vacancies are. They're more at the middle level and junior roles in some of those.
I think that necessarily reduces the importance of the role.
No, absolutely not. But the point I'm trying to make there is, as we are making a sentiment, a clear statement that says to succeed in the Ministry of Defence and in military roles in the future to the highest levels, we have an expectation that's now set about roles that should, over time, for people at early stages in their career, help inform their career decisions that they will want to take throughout. It's much harder for very, very senior roles to retrofit a NATO deployment on their career, but it's much easier for someone at the start of their career or midway through their career now to recognise that the opportunities of serving at NATO are now different than perhaps they were prior to that.
How many vacancies do you expect to have in a year's time?
as part of our model, we expect to continue to fill those vacancies.
Expect them to be filled?
No, continue to make an effort to fill those vacancies as we go through.
But there's no guarantee you'll fill those vacancies in 12 months' time?
I mean, the intention is that we have all our vacancies filled, but we know that there's a challenge overcoming some of the issues that I just mentioned in relation to the previous question about the offer that some of those roles serve.
You can understand the perception. If you're saying it's NATO first as our policy, there's 80 vacancies, and it doesn't quite tally.
No, if you compare a NATO first approach that this government will have, we aim to fill more vacancies, make service in NATO roles more attractive to people, especially in, say, European NATO roles where we know there's some obstacles. But if you compare the UK participation and fill rates to some of our comparable NATO allies, we have, we considerably fill more of our roles than many of those comparable nations as well. That's not to say that we should be taking an eye off the ball of those low rates, but the broad target is 95% fill, so we're nearly there at that, but we still have some work to do.
Good. I believe Michelle Scroggum also wants to comment on this point.
Thank you, Chair. Going back to the previous question, whether it's attractive or not to work there was something that was raised regularly on our visit. And one of the big issues was that you couldn't have your partner with you for a long portion of the time. So that would be a very negative way of looking at if you wanted to go and work there, but you can't have a partner with you. And those that could take the partners with them, they found it quite difficult to obtain employment while they were out there. Is that something that you're also looking at?
No, absolutely is something that we are aware of, and actually how... I realise not all NATO roles are in the European Union because some are further afield, but for the ones that are EU-based, especially where we're filling at NATO headquarters or SHAPE or their maritime missions in Italy, for instance, the Brexit deal removed the opportunities for people's partners to be able to work in the European Union. It is something that we have discussed with the EU, but it's also something that we've been discussing in terms of some of the new bilateral relationships and bilateral treaty refreshes to try and understand what might be possible within that, because it's absolutely right that when we're trying to, when the government says we want to put people at the heart of the agenda, it's important that we don't narrowly define the people as just the men and women who serve in uniform. They come with families, and we need to have a much greater understanding about the overall family unit as to how that works. So it is part of the work we're undertaking. I can't promise that's going to be changing overnight because that's wrapped up with much of the Brexit deal and the implications of that. But certainly it's not lost on many of our European allies that if they want more UK forces deployed, and this is about not just NATO roles but forward deploying some forces as well, and more permanent basing, that there is a obstacle that it would be helpful to overcome.
Thank you.
Yeah. Having commenced on the NATO first, I believe Ian Roon wants another bite at the cherry.
Yeah, just to wrap off, the point that I was making earlier is exactly what Mr Twigg was saying. Do you think some of those vacancies that we hold in NATO are because people are thinking that it's going to affect their career progression? And how do you propose to make it more attractive and prioritise those postings to make those people know that it actually might give them priority within their promotion sphere? Because at the moment, I think there's a culture where if you go to NATO, you're out of sight, out of mind, and with their peer groups left here, and the drafting officers are saying, well, actually, it's going to affect your career. When you come back, you have to start here. So I'm thinking, how do you go about changing that culture that actually applying for NATO is actually going to enhance your career, and possibly we'll look at it as a priority?
I entirely agree. So having an element of churn within our overall post-fill is quite normal. So a 5% churn is what NATO allows for. So we're nearly at that point. Not many of our NATO colleagues are anywhere near that, so that is welcome. But the offer we have to make is one that is about family life, service life, and also career. The SDR setting this out very clearly is enormously helpful. And certainly having spoken to some of our people who serve at NATO, they were looking for that type of very clear high-level commitment to their service and the role that they play at NATO, telling that story. And now our job is to play that forwards, as the Vice Marshal was talking about, playing that into the career management pathways of our people, being absolutely clear that NATO roles will be valued more. And I think to a certain extent, how that is implemented will, I imagine, look at things about how do you make sure that reporting deployments means deployment value of that, rather than just being we're not bumping into Bob anymore because Bob's been deployed to NATO, understanding that the role of that now attracts more value that we are placing as a department on that service. So to try and remove some of that kind of out of sight, out of mind perspectives that you are raising. But certainly, we need to value our people more in NATO and in overseas deployments. We've started on that journey. Some early announcements, I think, set the ambition very clearly, but there's more to do.
Thank you much. I'm glad that this issue is at a particularly good airing, because not just of the government's policy, Minister, with regards to NATO first, but whether it's been at our recent visit to Ramstein at the NATO headquarters Air Command, that some of them, as Ian Room mentioned, felt out of sight, out of mind, but also some of the Defence Committee's visits to military bases across the UK. If we don't quite get this right, this will be very off-putting to fill the vacancies that Derek Twigg pointed to earlier. So I'm sure the Minister will have heard that loud and clear. But let's move on to other issues pertaining to NATO. Lincoln Job, please. I'm
begging the Chair's indulgence. I just want to stay on this for one more, because I knew it was going to be me next. Air Vice Marshal, have you ever done a NATO job?
I haven't, but I have many colleagues that have had very filling...
Some of your best friends have been to NATO.
Very fulfilling roles in NATO, and actually have done very well in their career. So to the point that people don't have a fulfilling career out there, I think there's evidence to counter that. I think people go out, enjoy the role, enjoy the centrality of the role, enjoy the career, and then we utilise that expertise when we bring them back to the UK.
It's just that I did slightly identify a bit of a schism between what the Minister was saying, which I thought was... I thought you were going to suggest something like you couldn't attain starred rank unless you'd done a NATO post. And yet the Air Vice Marshal said the career managers have taken away the SDR. They've seen the words NATO first, and they're going to ensure that, I think the quote was that career path is catered for. And that seemed like quite a gap between those two positions.
No, I don't think it is. It's about how you implement that objective. And what I think we have to be very cognizant of is, if we want to fundamentally change the incentives within the system about attractiveness of job roles and attractiveness of an individual for the next job role, we have to have that throughout their entire career structure. So simply saying you can't attain this rank if you haven't done this would be unfair on those individuals who have not had the opportunity to be able to do that straight away. But setting the demand signal within the wider system that then starts pointing at those roles, well, that makes those roles more attractive for individuals to be able to go there. It also makes those people with that experience more attractive in terms of their career management pathway. So I think both are entirely achievable, and I think having set that very clear commitment from ministers and in the SDR, I expect that to be carried through and implemented through the career management pathways. I also expect us to continue to look at how we improve the offer. All those things need to go hand in hand, but that is the direction of travel we're very clearly going in, to say, if you have a NATO first approach, that has to be a lived NATO first approach, not just something that sits in the SDR on a shelf, and that's why we're seeking to implement it in all our activities.
I recognise the committee is primarily interested in military careers, but you might be interested to know that I deployed to Afghanistan as a political advisor, policy advisor, under NATO command and control, reporting to NRDC, Italy for the first 2 months, and then subsequently the ARC, and in those roles under the chain of command of JSC Brunson. So it does matter for senior policy people too, and I think I've done my time.
Thank you very much indeed. Moving on to the prioritisation of resourcing between NATO and the Joint Expeditionary Force. Mm-hmm. Who makes those balance of investment and resource prioritisation decisions in the Ministry of Defence?
So all resource allocations are done via the established process of creating an armed forces plan that flows from the SDR and allocating those resources. They're not necessarily... there's temptation to answer your question to say there's a set of forces held solely for JEF and there's a set of forces held solely for NATO. That's not the case. And in many cases, you can see JEF operations being entirely complementary. If you look at, say, the activity of activating the JEF options in the Baltic after the S-Link 2 situation there, we were able to activate some JEF options which have now docked very neatly under that NATO umbrella. And in fact, one of the key parts of JEF operations now is that it provides greater flexibility on a sub-Article 5 activity focused on the High North, North Atlantic and Baltic area, so we can move faster than some of those NATO aspects, but can be badged as NATO because they are NATO. They can be integrated into NATO at the same time. So that's where those things fit together. And certainly, if you look at some of the JEF exercises that we have done, they're entirely complementary to NATO. So I wouldn't want the committee to believe that in any way our commitment to JEF is in competition with NATO. Far from it. Actually, resource allocation delivered between JEF and NATO is delivered as to look at our whole force approach. And those forces may be dual-hatted, especially if they're held in some kind of reserve capacity for us to be able to use in support of our objectives. And it might be that our objectives are best delivered via a NATO model, or via a bilateral model, or via a kind of wider perspective. But that gives us the options to be able to deliver that.
I mean, it's just worth giving you the feedback that, and I have to be very careful to launder my sources here, on one of our visits that we got the impression from a NATO perspective that to a certain extent JEF activities represented sort of buccaneering privateers and not altogether helpful in the NATO construct. So that's what it was suggested to us. But just on this balance of resource decision, is that ever a political decision, or do you just let the machine do it?
No, I mean, I certainly don't recognise the buccaneering suggestion there, because actually it's part of an integrated model of deterrence and deployments that we have across the European theatre. And our partners in JEF are very, very clear that JEF is entirely complementary with NATO. What we have to do, especially now Finland and Sweden have joined the NATO alliance, where previously they were members of JEF but not NATO, that has changed some of the dynamics between JEF and NATO in the fact that now the membership of both are the same, so to speak. So that has helped the integration further. But when it comes to the decision around which allocations go where, yes, clearly there is a role for ministerial sign-off on the big picture, but as part of defence reform and how we are allocating resources to the commitments that we're making, the recommendations would come from the policy situation. I might ask Paul to describe with defence reform, the decision-making matrix that comes from the Department of State that sets the policy, MSHQ, the military headquarters that effectively raises the personnel and deploys them, and then resourced via the National Armaments Director Group to provide the kit and equipment they need. I think that's broadly correct, Paul, but correct me if I'm wrong.
That's right, Minister. So exactly as the Minister says, ultimately ministers decide. The process that we have in place essentially allows us to take a look at what the forward demand is, the availability of forces, and then to put together a kind of plan which utilises not just ships, tanks and aeroplanes, but thinks about other levers of defence endeavour like exports, for example, because it's not just about thinking about forces, it's all of the things that defence does to contribute to the kind of wider European and global security. From a Department of State perspective, my job is to set out in a way that's kind of clear and useful for planning what the policy criteria are. And then the process, which is called the strategic effects cycle, is actually run by a team under Air Vice Marshal Fluin. So he can maybe talk about the way in which the MSHQ discharges that responsibility to do the plan and the force allocation.
Just to echo the Minister's point, I think whether it's the JEF, the CJEF, Lancaster House, Trinity House agreement, I think they are all additive to capability and credibility and therefore NATO deterrence. Just to reassure you on resource, we have a strategic effects cycle that takes a golden thread from the strategic trench to the NSS, the Armed Forces Plan, the policy envelopes that Paul's just talked to, and matches resource to it. It also ensures that we're not exceeding the resource we have available. So it very carefully matches ambition to resource, and within that, undoubtedly, there is choice. To reassure you, that SEC runs all the time. It manages the in-year position. And indeed, the recent Middle East crisis meant we had to adapt our force posture elsewhere, but it also looks to the 5-year plan, and indeed the plan for 26 to 31 is about to go through 4 stars to ministers for sign-off.
Thank you. I just wanted to be clear whether, I think, Minister, you described it as comes from ministerial sign-off, and Mr Wyatt described it as requires political direction. I just note that distinction, Chair. Thank you very much indeed.
I think it's the same one, to be honest. Ministers decide, as Paul says.
Good. I believe Mike Martin wanted to come in on this point.
Thanks, Chair. Is there a danger of double counting here? I note that we've got, with Finland joining, we've got commitments with Finland. In Estonia, we have a battle group, but actually we're holding the remainder of the brigade in the UK. We also have a commitment to the NATO mission in Kosovo, where we are the reinforcing nation. We've got the JEF. We're meant to provide the Allied Rapid Reaction Corps headquarters with 2 divisions. And that's just in the European theatre, let alone something kicking off in the Middle East, which it seems to do with, regularity. So, if I were Russia and I were to seek to overload Britain's capabilities, I would create tensions in all of those areas at the same time, which Russia is perfectly capable of doing. And we would then not be able to, one assumes, fill all of those commitments. I mean, could you comment on that, Minister?
Yeah, I think I'll bring the team in on the details of how we manage the tensions between different commitments. What I would say is that the SDR very clearly set out that our defensive posture and moving to a war-fighting readiness is underpinned, yes, by our NATO membership and our leading role within NATO, but also the bilateral and multilateral and minilateral agreements that take place that we have with our partners across Europe at the same time, and that provides options and optionality about how you respond to a situation. And certainly the greater number of options that we have, actually the increased deterrence against Russia causing difficulties, because it provides us with more options for a response and a greater number of options that they have to plan against in terms of their disruptive activity, for instance. But it's certainly true that some forces are held with multiple hats on in terms of readiness. That is pretty standard for military deployments. And so some of our reserve forces, for instance, that we hold at readiness for any eventuality may be held at readiness for other bits. That's proportionate, I think, to manage the risk against them. And certainly when it comes to that risk, we work with our NATO allies and with NATO headquarters in terms of being very clear about what forces are held at readiness, what is the readiness timing that would be required, and that means we're able to respond. But for most of our NATO missions, we work as part of a multilateral, multinational framework, so we can pull in resource across NATO. And certainly when it comes to adjusting readiness or deploying, that's something that we do in partnership with NATO rather than in opposition to, so they are better able to understand what resources and assets does SACA have available at any one time. But perhaps that could be...
I just have a very quick comeback on that, because I call it double counting, you call it double hatting. Are you personally comfortable, Minister, with the degree of double counting where our forces are assigned to 2 potential operations avenues of deployment? Are you comfortable that we can fulfil everything we need to if we are pressed in all of those areas that I listed in my earlier question?
Yes. What we need to make sure is that our ability to respond to those crises, and we plan for, in some cases, concurrent crises. If you're going beyond concurrent crises, you're moving into a much more of a war-fighting position, which then moves from effectively holding forces at readiness to forward deploying forces. That is a very different situation if we were in that stage of a build up to a conflict, then holding forces in readiness and being able to respond to smaller scale crises, which is a different part of our war planning. And so am I comfortable with where we are at the moment? Yes. Do I want to make sure that we fill the gaps in our personnel for all our units? Absolutely. It's one of the reasons why we put so much effort into dealing with the retention and recruitment crisis that we inherited, because I want to make sure all our units are fully deployable. And to be fully deployable, you need to address the gaps that may exist within that personnel. And certainly for units that we run hot quite frequently, and if use the Air Force as a good example, because that's the most deployed part of our armed forces at the moment. There's a lot of demand on some of our combat air assets, in particular Typhoons. And so being able to make sure that with the demand that we place upon them, there's the requisite time for reconstitution of those forces, for training and for upgrades is a part of the planning cycle that we deliver at the moment.
I'd absolutely support the Minister's point. The force attribution against the plan is very carefully managed through the strategic effects cycle, which I've just described. And I think a good example of that is the recent Middle East crisis and the combat air tension, where we very quickly reattributed, reprioritised, and were still able to balance the force against all the demands managed very carefully through that cycle.
Where did you pull airframes from to do the recent Middle East crisis?
So we had a high readiness squadron that we deployed forward, and we are able to rebalance the force against the priorities that are managed through the SEC, which draw, as I say, the golden thread through SCR and SS, and is ultimately signed off by ministers.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Right, let's move on to Michelle Scroggin, please.
Thank you, Chair. There'll be capability decisions that come out on the back of the Defence Investment Plan in the autumn. Have you considered whether some of our allies could take on some of the burden that the UK currently has?
So it's a very fair question. So the Defence Investment Plan will be looking not just at kit and equipment as the old equipment plan did. That effectively loaded the attention on kit and equipment and didn't load it on infrastructure at all and our people. And so the Defence Investment Plan is designed to be broader in its approach than the versions that it replaces. What we are looking at is effectively the implementation of NATO's new regional plans, because NATO's new regional plans that are being implemented at the moment changes, some cases, the force laydown and how we would fight in any particular area. So as an example, it's not necessarily about swapping job A between the UK and another tasking. It's about how do we make that role more efficient. So if we take the Baltics, for example, so the UK maintains and will continue to maintain our forward land force in Estonia. But what we're seeing is the previous construct, on a very basic level, fought as Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, as very different battle spaces. What we now see with the new NATO regional plan for that area is a single battle space, effectively, with the units working together much more. So in that respect, the objective is to increase our lethality, which enhances our deterrence, increase our interoperability with not just host nations, and actually NATO regards our FLF in Estonia as the best-in-class example of integration between a framework nation and a host nation. But how do we make sure that we do so? If you're thinking about all the Baltic states, and now you're including Finland and Sweden into that wider kind of like Baltics, Nordics area, we need to have greater interoperability. And that does provide opportunities for new partners to bring new capabilities in there, but it also creates a demand signal from NATO for nations to be able to invest in what they're looking at doing. So, for instance, having more Swedish fighters involved in that space means that provides opportunities for where you distribute your combat air within that wider battle space. So, are we going to NATO saying, please can we stand down from this, this and this so someone else can do that? That's no, but that negotiation, that discussion is a normal part of implementing NATO regional plans. And that was signed off at I think it was Washington Summit that signed it off. We're implementing those at the moment. And in my point of view, that makes us more efficient. That also makes us more interoperable, because one of the concerns that certainly I had in opposition, which is something that we are mindful of at the moment, is it's not enough just to increase defence spending for our European partners in particular. What is spent needs to be more interoperable and deployable. And in that respect, actually, we increase our overall ability to deter Russian aggression.
Okay, you mentioned the US. If the US withdraws capabilities, where's the UK best placed to replace those?
So the US Global Force Posture Review is ongoing at the moment, and it will be for them to decide what capabilities they seek to redistribute across their priorities globally. I think, to be fair to the Americans on this respect, they have been saying under various administrations for quite some time their intention to rebalance some of their global force posture from a Euro-Atlantic, from Africa, into an Indo-Pacific focus. what we've been reassured by in terms of our discussions is it's not withdrawal, it's a new balance. That's really important because the debate around this often excludes the balance side and the commitment that the Americans still have to Euro-Atlantic security. And so the discussions that will take place around this will look at, what is the opportunities, what's the roadmap ahead, and what the Americans have been very clear on is that big picture in terms of the rebalancing. It is burden sharing, not exit, which I think is really important to restate. And then within that...
We're talking rebalancing rather than exiting. Where would we balance? So what would we be bringing to that as the UK?
We're already stepping up as a country in terms of looking at it. So the Americans have asked Europe as a whole to spend more on defence, to step up on the support for Ukraine, and to demonstrate our ability to refill our stockpiles, as an example, to be better able to warfight, so we have greater deterrence. We're already doing many of those things, and if you look at the F-35A announcement that we made a few weeks ago, the ability for the UK now to say, not only are we purchasing F-35As, which is better for our training for F-35B pilots, but also it allows us to join the NATO nuclear mission. But that's a really important part of increasing our lethality, because I think one of the bits that we have a perspective on is for NATO to be stronger in an era of enhanced threats, we need to increase our lethality. That means increasing our interoperability. That means, increasing our spend, the depth of our magazines, our experience of deploying together. And that is effectively, if you look at, say, some of the recent NATO exercises that we've participated in, JEF exercises from, say, Northern Strike in Finland to exercise Hedgehog, brilliantly named exercise, through to Steadfast Dart in Central and Eastern Europe. What we're seeking to do is demonstrate the ability of NATO partners and the UK to deploy quickly, to create some of those dilemmas for anyone that seeks to oppose us, but also in doing so that creates a reassurance for our American friends that actually Europe is stepping up on security, and that is our objective as a government. And I think you will have seen that at the recent NATO summit with every single, with a broad approach to say 3.5% by 2035, and then behind that the increase in the ability to have a greater defensive posture.
The only thing I'll add, I think, to the Minister is that NATO have a very mature planning process, and the NATO defence planning process. So if a member were to alter their posture, then that would be considered through that process, and the rebalancing would occur through that process.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's also a pleasure to welcome Richard Ford to our Defence Committee hearing today. Richard is guesting from the Foreign Affairs Committee, and it's wonderful to have your expertise here, especially given that you were the former Lib Dem spokesman for Defence. On to you, Richard.
Thank you, Dan. And thank you, Minister. Just staying with the one example that you gave there, Minister, of the procurement of the F-35A. I wonder what you make of the charge that this decision to procure nuclear certified aircraft is, while it's on the one hand, it's restoring sub-strategic nuclear capability to the UK. On the other hand, ironically, it's making the UK more dependent on US decision-making. What do you make of that?
Well, firstly, it's good to see more West Country MPs doing defence, so good to see you back doing that. The decision to purchase F-35A is deliberately designed to increase the strategic dilemmas that we can pose as the United Kingdom, but also as a NATO alliance, to Russian nuclear escalation. And so our current proposition at the moment only has nuclear deterrence at the strategic level. And by and large, with one nuclear submarine always at sea, maintaining a continued at-sea deterrent, we can't change the deployments, the posture, the visibility of those submarines for very obvious reasons. And so it means that we don't have the ability to manage nuclear escalation in the same way as we now will do when the F-35As arrive towards the end of this decade, beginning of next decade. And that is an important part of providing us greater options in relation to that. It also helps solidify and firm up some of our European friends who have really welcomed the addition of the UK as part of NATO's nuclear mission. because that provides greater certainty for them behind their involvement, and greater optionality because certainly having the RAF involved, not just because I'm sitting next to an RAF officer at this point, but certainly the RAF's involvement as especially the Mother Air Force for many of our European friends, is a substantial increase in how the NATO nuclear mission is felt by many of our allies. It also helps deliver a very strong US objective in terms of increasing European warfighting deterrent capability. And so it's a different nuclear model than we have with our continuous at-sea deterrent. It doesn't take anything away from CASD. In fact, this government, I think, has been the most vocal in our commitment to CASD that I've seen for a very long time. But it provides additional options for us. And yes, those additional options do play into that wider framework of a NATO nuclear mission. So it's not an independent deterrent, independent weapon that only we decide when we could use.
And that is a departure from what we saw when we last had this level of tension between Russia and the West. Because when we were last at this sort of level of tension back in the 1990s, the UK had its own independent air-launched nuclear deterrent. Admiral Lord West recently said in the Lords, or rather asked in the Lords, the Defence Minister, Lord Coker, whether the UK ought to think about reassessing its nuclear doctrine. What do you make of that suggestion?
So it depends what, I don't mean to put words into Lord West's mouth. I think that's a very dangerous pursuit for anyone, let alone a minister, to try and do. I think the fundamental to the question about updating our nuclear doctrine, well, clearly if we have an air leg to our nuclear capabilities, that does in respect update our nuclear doctrine, because our nuclear doctrine was founded and present, at least in recent years, based on a single nuclear platform, the continuous at-sea nuclear deterrent. So it provides greater options for us when those F-35As arrive, and that does provide greater options about deployment, training, exercising. That creates more opportunities for us to signal, manage escalation, and deliver. So in respect of, is it different because it provides more option? Yes, the playbook will need a few more pages in to be able to deal with that. Does it take away from our fundamentals of nuclear deterrence with our strategic independent nuclear deterrence? No, it does not. I think it's really important that when we're talking about adding to that the deterrent capability, that we are not seeking to diminish, remove, or somewhat qualify what our submarines can offer. It just provides additional options for us.
And one last question. I mean, it provides additional options, it provides additional capability, but I'm suggesting this could be an opportunity to review the UK's nuclear posture. And here I'm thinking about deliberate ambiguity posture that we've had for many years. I wonder whether we last had this when NATO had this conventional inferiority to the Warsaw Pact. Now we have conventional superiority to Russia. So I wonder what you make of looking again at our nuclear posture.
So in the respect that an air leg to our nuclear deterrence provides an update and a change from where we were before we announced it, we will be adding that to our fighting spirit and how we plan out, and how that provides options for our managing of any crisis and escalation and the support. So that would be a given. I don't think it fundamentally changes the key facets of our nuclear doctrine, though. And I think now I would make a clear distinction between the kind of like main doctrinal nuclear policy and of deterrence, and the additional ways of being able to message that to an adversary to deploy sub-strategic weapons in a deterrent capability, and how we do so alongside our allies. Because the key part, I think, about the F-35A mission is it would be delivered with our NATO nuclear allies, rather than being an independent nuclear deterrent that we dedicate to NATO. And certainly the Secretary of State has this wonderful phrase about us being very British about our dedicating our nuclear deterrent to NATO, in the respect that we have done it for decades, and are very British that we don't often really push that, we just do it. whereas debate around where French nuclear sovereignty is has recently created a lot of energy about whether there's an involvement of dedicating that to, say, a wider European mission, for instance. We already do that for NATO, and that is not changing in terms of where our CASD side of things fits. So I think I'd want to understand more about when you say doctrine, what you mean by doctrine. Certainly in terms of posture, we would maintain the CASD as it is today. And in fact, actually, we hope to make it better in terms of not having as long missions and bringing on the new Dreadnought-class submarines.
This isn't just about capability, this is also about intent. And this is about signalling the conditions under which the deterrent could be used. So we've had this long-standing approach, a posture of deliberate ambiguity, and yet many Russian experts are telling us that this time we need to make clear how we are communicating. We don't have the same bilateral links that we had before. We don't have the arms control arrangements, the INF treaty. So it could be an opportunity to look again at our posture.
It certainly provides more opportunities. What I would say is that this is not a capability being developed from scratch. And I think that's useful for us to look at because, frankly, as a defence nerd in this house since I got elected, there wasn't much debate in this place about NATO's nuclear mission prior to the F-35A announcement that we made and mentioned in the SDR. That can create the impression that this is a brand new thing that is being invented for the very first time. What the NATO nuclear mission is a mission that has been in place since the 1960s, so we're joining it, and coming with that comes effectively the body of work that has been established with NATO for many decades, and so that provides us with, yes, we're not starting with a blank bit of paper to then rewrite where we get to, but certainly a new era of threat. Our perspective was that we needed to increase the number of options that we had, and that's why we've made the F-35 announcement as we have done, and it's been incredibly well received by our NATO nuclear allies and the US in particular.
Thank you very much. Minister, several individuals who have given evidence to our committee, including, for example, Ed Arnold, they've criticised the UK government's position, and, for example, we have not met many of the NATO capability targets in previous years. The UK is also at the bottom or towards the bottom in terms of the NDPP, the NATO Defence Planning Process capability targets. Now, with regards to the progress reports, we're towards the bottom. So, would you say that the government is being somewhat disingenuous when it says that everything is harmonious with regards to UK capability targets and NATO?
No, I wouldn't use those words at all. What I would say is I would apply the assessment of the situation we inherited a year ago, where we know that our armed forces have been hollowed out and underfunded for quite some time. That does mean we need to invest more in defence and our capabilities. That is the reason why at the general election I stood on a manifesto to increase defence to spending to 2.5%. We've now brought that forwards 3 years early, and we've gone further with 3% in the next Parliament and 3.5% by 2035. That provides us with greater certainty now to deal with some of our capability gaps that we've inherited, deal with the fact that for many cases against some of our stockpiles, they're not as full as I would like them to be. And in that respect, that's where the SDR sets out the move from to warfighting readiness. That does require us to address some of our capabilities and to reform some of them. That means in some cases retiring old platforms and bringing on new ones, and there'll be a period of transition between old and new in respect of that. And we've seen that from some of the early announcements that we made, retiring HMS Albion and HMS Bulwark, two ships that were never planned to go to sea again under the last government.
So basically the aim of the government is to meet those capability targets, including those that we hadn't previously met. But let me move on to just, I know we've got a lot to cover yet, and there's still many individuals who want to come in. Let me move on to our leadership in NATO. Now, during the recent NATO summit, Spain said that they would only like to meet 2.1% in terms of their spend. Slovakia, the Prime Minister, before the summit, noted that armament isn't their top priority at the moment. They would like to concentrate on other issues. So what has the UK government done to persuade some of our European allies that they also need to contribute, just as the UK needs to contribute to European security? Could you perhaps enlighten us about the UK government's role to persuade Spain and Slovakia or other European allies to meet their targets?
So, as an approach, since we took office last year, we have been very deliberate and clear in stepping up our role within NATO and within European leadership. Part of that was predicated on resetting many of the relationships that our assessment was had deteriorated under the last government. The EU reset is an important part of that with the strategic defence partnership that came out of that. But also the increased role the UK has in terms of Ukraine support, I think has made a big difference in terms of the impact and quality of UK leadership. So we now co-chair the UDCG with our friends in Germany, and that has,
Minister,
for instance...
I fully agree with that. Look, a lot of us are very complimentary about the UK government's role with respect to Ukraine. My question is more about our conversations with the Spanish, the Slovakians, those that aren't meeting the targets. What has the government done to ensure that they too are stepping up to the plate?
Yeah, the point I was trying to make was the increased leadership provides with increased influence in that debate. And that's the deliberate strategy that we have been trying to undertake. We've been making the very strong case to many of our European friends and NATO allies that the era of 2% is a relic of a previous time and is not applicable to the security challenges that we face. So therefore, when we came to office, we were making the case that we needed to, yes, the UK was increasing defence spending, but we need others to do so, and not just increase spending, but how you spend it, which when I was speaking to answering Michelle Schwab's question earlier, talking about that kind of like increased lethality of interoperability piece. We continue to have those conversations across NATO with our friends, as indeed we do in terms of those member states that are part of the EU as well, about UK participation. Now the door has been opened to potential participation in a number of those EU projects. Those conversations are ongoing at the moment, but certainly it's our assessment that we have to spend more on defence. It is a commitment that was effectively made and agreed to at the NATO summit that we've had. Our job now is to assist in spending that money wisely across Europe.
Good. Right, thank you very much, Minister. Right, let's now move on to Homeland Defence and Resilience. And to lead us off, Fred Thomas.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, Homeland Defence and Resilience takes up a whole chapter in the SDR, and I believe it's part of your portfolio as well in your ministerial brief. I'm going to ask a few questions around how plans are progressing. But first, to acknowledge that this government inherited a home defence programme or plan from the previous government. Because we've had loads of questions about NATO, just to get on the record, is that inherited home defence plan currently the UK's contribution to NATO? And is that what NATO holds to be our Article 3 national defence plan, as NATO would call it? That's sort of yes or no?
I mean, broadly, but we've implemented changes against that, and as the Cabinet Office leads broadly on the aggregation of our Article 3 commitments across the UK, we're making changes against that. We've been very clear that Article 3 has not been upheld in the way that we would like it to be, and that's why it's not just Homeland Defence that features heavily in the SDR, but also the chapter on whole of society approach, which I think actually can be taken both an inside and military perspective, but can really be viewed as an Article 3 chapter as well. And that's why the Cabinet Office are undertaking updates of that.
Would you say that currently, and if the answer is no, I think you can safely point to previous government and what you inherited, but would you say currently we are upholding our Article 3 responsibilities in NATO?
I think we've been very clear that we are not satisfied with Article 3 in the UK, but equally, I think that is a position that every European NATO member state is very clear on as well, that there has been a correct focus on Article 5, but there hasn't been many people looking at Article 3, and that is why we are seeking to change that with both the SDR, the National Security Strategy, and an updated Homeland Defence Plan.
Thank you. We'll come on to the whole of society approach. I think we're interested in that. I just wanted to understand a bit more about division of responsibility and accountability. So who would you say is in charge of national resilience in the UK at a political level?
Overall responsibility sits with the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster in the Cabinet Office. Then there is responsibilities held across government for different expertise. For instance, last week with the chair, I was in front of the National Security Committee, and we were looking at cable defence, underwater cable defence. Although it's the Cabinet Office that holds overall responsibility for Homeland resilience, DCIT look after cables. The Royal Navy looks after protection of some of those cables in deep water, for instance, and there's a civilian role for looking after some of our CNI. So I think it's important that...
That kind of different stakeholders, shall we say, does that concern you from a kind of accountability point of view, or do you think that's good as a system?
I think it only concerns me if it doesn't work. And what we've got at the moment is a system that works in terms of structure, in terms of an understanding about who has responsibility for what. What I think the SDR sets out clearly is the fact that I think we have underinvested in our homeland defence and underinvested in our or haven't really adopted a whole of society approach to meet the threats that we have. So that means how we meet and improve homeland defence work is not just an MOD job. That has to be all departments stepping up and doing so in a coordinated fashion, and that's where the Cabinet Office leads.
I understand the Duchy of Lancaster is making a statement shortly in the Chamber about a resilience action plan. Have you been briefed on that already?
The Ministry of Defence will be involved with all of those, but it'd be for the CDL to make his statement.
Have you been briefed on that personally?
So we're involved in the work that underpins some of that, but I haven't seen every word of his statement, no, not yet.
Okay. I think there is concern that some of our national resilience is too stovepiped, and the idea that the Duchy of Lancaster making a resilience action plan statement in the Chamber today, and the Armed Forces Minister hasn't been briefed in detail on it, sort of suggests that there might not be very good information sharing, which we understand is really difficult across government departments. Nevertheless, slightly concerning. One of the things the National Security Strategy laid out is the need for exercising and sort of annually testing this whole of society approach. And we'll come on to the cadets and the reserves, but there's been talk of sort of, so far, the only really thing that's been made public about that is the idea of testing the ability of the government to send out an SMS text message to everyone's phones, which I hope they're able to do. I think we kind of got through that in COVID as well. From a kind of armed forces point of view, what do you see as a resilience exercise possibility?
Well, the first thing I would challenge on, I don't regard it as slightly concerning in the way that you framed it in your question, mainly because most of today I've spent either here or preparing for here, so I haven't been looking at other aspects of my portfolio because I've been in front of the committee. So I'm not worried about that because I think the structure broadly works. And that is important because to make this work, you both need to have the central leadership, but you need each part of the system taking responsibility for those and to be trusted to deliver their part of that resilience framework. And that's why the overall approach to say do more on Article 3 matters. I think certainly the national SMS which was used previously but was also used in Plymouth, where we both represent when it came to the Kian bomb, for instance, shows that some of the structures work, but it needs to be more than just those minor elements. And if you take, for instance, parts of our Article 3 role that defence would have a larger role in, some aspects of cyber resilience, for instance, protection of energy infrastructure offshore, cables and other parts like that. We've identified that in the SDR as an area that needs further investment. It is an area that we're working with cross-government colleagues to be able to deliver increased investment and coordination on. And certainly my experience, having done this role now for a year, is that actually the cross-government coordination on this is pretty good. What we need to do is make sure that the spending and the prioritisation of spend within each department delivers that wider whole. And I think to your concern about the individual stovepipes, certainly that's what we inherited broadly, it's fair to say, but we need to make sure the coordination between all those, because I don't need to know the detail of what Department of Health are doing. I just need to be reassured that in the event of needing to press play on the plan, DH have everything they need ready to go.
Good. Okay, thank you. Appreciate you were busy this morning. I doubt they've written this action plan this morning. Can we come on to cadets, please, if we can, and kind of reserve forces? And Really interested to see a lot of focus on that in the SDR. And this is kind of built from this whole of society approach. How do we communicate to the wider public that we are in a heightened state of threat? And you spoke there, Minister, about prioritisation and spending of money. How much new money is the MOD going to spend on cadets specifically? And given the data for pull-through from people who go through a cadet's experience to then actually joining the military shows that it's like, that's not why you'd invest money in it. There's very poor pull-through. Can you explain the reasoning behind that a bit?
So cadets are led by the Minister for Veterans and People, who I can write to the committee with the details of spend against our commitment to increase cadets by 30%, which we've set out in the SDR. And so the full implementation of that is with my colleague Al. So happy writing to the committee because I'm not across the formal detail of that. The approach of doing so, though, I think is worth just dwelling on, because I don't quite share your perspective that it's not value for money in terms of recruitment. What we know is that people that are cadets and join the military serve longer than those people who are not cadets prior to that. So there is a real value for doing so. But it also creates the opportunity for us to have greater visibility and surface area for the military. So one of the key parts of cadets is not only providing experience for people to understand the opportunities that military life and the service culture and ethos provides, it also creates greater visibility within society. And one of the reasons that we did want to increase cadet numbers is because as the population increases and the national service generation sadly leaves us, the experience of families and individuals across the country knowing someone who serves is considerably reduced. That's not the case in Plymouth, where we have lots of military people, but across the nation, that is certainly more of the case. So a greater focus on reserves and a greater focus on cadets, as well as our commitment to increase the size of the army, the modest increase to 76,000 in the next parliament we want to make, is all designed to increase one of the reasons to do so is to increase visibility of those services and create greater connection with the public.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's move on to Derek Dwight, please.
Thank you. Minister, since the SDR, does Defence need to change how it works with other government departments to ensure readiness and resilience? And if so, how?
Yes, I mean the SDR set out that we want to do more to improve our Article 3 role, to improve Homeland defence, to improve national security, and some of those are shared endeavours. So if I take an example of, say, cyber resilience, we've restructured some of our cyber capabilities since the SDR in terms of creating a new cyber and EM command and looking again at the role of previously known as UK Stratcom in terms of the role with cyber, but we've also undertaking more to work with other colleagues that have responsibilities. So if you take DCIT as a good example, and I actually think the relationship between MOD and DCIT is one that I don't think gets enough attention, because I think it's a huge opportunities in the future. But what is the role of DCIT? What's the role of the Home Office in terms of our cyber defence? And certainly at a very operational level, the connections between those departments are superb, really detailed, and work really well in terms of how do we keep our cyber infrastructure resilient. I think where we have to improve is both in terms of the more strategic policy level about how do we make sure we've got enough people with the right skills, which is often not the sexiest topic, but is absolutely critical, because if we're not having the right skills within cyber, we're not able to defend ourselves. And so that is a bigger play than just MOD and DCIT. That's a whole of government affair. So there are improvements we are seeking to make, and that's partly why the SDR has broad recommendations in some of these areas where the national security strategy sits in.
Do ministers have to do more to drive change?
I think to implement change, yes. I mean, ministers need to set the clear strategic direction, and in the MOD we have done by adopting all the recommendations in the SDR and by driving the SDR consequences. So it's not just implementing the 62 recommendations, although we are and we will. Yeah. It is by taking the spirit of the SDR as well and applying that to the whole range of policy areas that flow from the SDR.
Okay, if I can take another case study you just doing cyber security. So in the SDR, there is a whole section on defence medical services. Mm-hmm. And in the start of that section, it says, ensuring the health and operational medical care of the UK's armed forces, and they use the word is vitally important to deterrence and defence. And they go on to say there's a moral and legal duty on the part of government, and healthcare is also among the top 3 factors in personnel retention. So I was surprised, given that we already know there's a major issue on defence medical services, because Lord Robinson said this when he came to pre-brief us on the SDO before that occurred. And we know that General Rob McGowan on the 17th of December, when I asked him are the shortcomings in defence medical support, his reply was correct. So I put in a parliamentary question, which to ask the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care what recent discussions they had with the Secretary of State for Defence on increasing the number of medical reservists joining the armed forces. Now, to my surprise, as part of the answer, and I won't read it all out, but clearly they're suggesting there's some discussions taking place at the official level. There have been no recent ministerial discussions on this issue. Now, I find that quite shocking given the state of defence medical services, because as we know, one of the biggest reservoir for defence to have medics, to have medically qualified people, is from the reservists in the National Health Service. You know that from the way they were stretched during the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts. And even in this section on defence medical services, it talks about a defence health partnership. Can you tell me why there's been no ministerial level interaction on this issue?
I can investigate that when I go back to the office in terms of looking at it. I mean, the SDR is right that if we want to move to warfighting readiness, which the SDR sets out clearly, we will need to invest considerably more in defence medical services, and that's effectively sets out the challenge.
I understand. My issue is that given the seriousness of the problem with defence medical services, I'm just very surprised there's been no ministerial discussion between departments of health and the Ministry of Defence on this issue. But anyway, we'll leave.
I mean, certainly some of the areas I have regular conversations with some of my DH colleagues around some of these areas, but happy taking that detail away. Okay, thanks.
And the other question, I think the committee welcomes, well, it does welcome the government's intention to enable scrutiny of the UK's war-fighting readiness by publishing metrics every year. So how will you consult on developing those metrics? How will you consult us, the committee, on that?
Well, I might ask colleagues to come in on the details of the metrics. Certainly, if I took the broader piece around the journey we need to be on and why metrics are an important part of it, and then ask colleagues to come on the detail, I was quite surprised when I came into office about some of the poor performance of our, even poorer performance of our recruitment than I had seen in opposition. And so being clear about the journey we need to be on is an important part of not only driving the change, holding those responsible accountable, including ministers, but also being clear with our people that things are changing. Because I think there has been, certainly in some areas, defence housing being a good example, there's been lots of warm words said, but not necessarily always the action under the previous administration to deal with some of those deep-rooted
We talk about war-fighting readiness, you know.
Yeah, but, you know...
I understand their important support for our service personnel, but in terms
no, absolutely, but it's one of those key bits. If our service personnel don't feel that the offer and their experience in service life is good enough, we know what they do, they leave. And that creates gaps, and that is one of the reasons that contributes to the fact that when we took office, for every 100 people joining, 130 were leaving. Well, you know, inflows now up 17% and outflows down 9%. So we're making progress, but there's more to do. In terms of warfighting readiness, I might ask Paul.
We need to know what these metrics you're considering and how we'll be consulted as a committee on this. Because, you know, this has been a long-standing running saw with this committee.
So it's actually outside of my portfolio. It will be a combination of my colleague,
does anyone know then?
The Director General for Transformation, who will be working on the SJR implementation and making sure we've got the right metrics in terms of the plan. And I don't know whether Flunk, from a tasking of the armed forces perspective, has anything to add.
So one thing I would add is clearly if we're going to improve warfighting readiness, we need to be able to measure it. We need to be able to baseline it. That work has been, I can assure the committee, that work has been going on for a number of years under General Rob McGowan, and are improving defence output work across all of the services and all of the domains. That's seen us be able to baseline availability, capability and sustainability across all our capability areas and set improvement goals. There's been considerable progress across all three services in achieving that, and we now have very clear metrics with which we can measure our warfighting readiness moving forward.
My question was, how will we be consulted?
So happy taking that work right into the committee and looking at it. Okay. I suspect that the committee will probably have views that you can share with us on that.
While we're talking about Tracy, I know Vice Marshal, because you've spoken quite a bit about combat air and various guises and lethality. Can I ask you, Vice Marshal, this week, what percentage of our combat air is available for operations?
You understand that that's sensitive data, and we wouldn't want to talk
will
about
that. Will that be not one of the
forum.
metrics that will be shown? Will that be not one of the metrics shared with this committee?
It is one of the metrics we track very closely, but it's held
will not be shared with this committee.
It's held at a higher classification.
So
that's probably
heard in private with the committee, or will that?
So I think
you get where I'm coming from here. We're talking about which metrics.
Yeah, no, I entirely understand where you're coming from in terms of looking at for anything that we seek to publish. There's a difference between what we can track and what we can't publish. Yes. I'm very happy looking at the progress of that work to see what might be able to be shared with the committee in a private capacity due to the classification and security measures that sometimes sit around it. But what I would say is that the whole point of being transparent around some of our progress here, there's a deliberate messaging benefit of being honest and transparent publicly around some, but also the difficulty in the journey as to how we recover some of our capabilities.
This you can say is obviously one of another of the issue is what clearly there will be some things that can be shared in private, some things will be shared in public, but obviously when we're talking metrics, we're not talking about just public metrics, it's how we as a committee hold the MOD to account. And obviously knowing the number of combat aircraft which are available for operations at a particular time is an important way of holding the Ministry of Defence to account, because that's vitally important to our defence of our country. Yeah. Yeah.
Good. Thank you very much. I believe Lincoln Jock wanted to come ahead.
So, Minister, fairly recently there was a major incident where 3 electricity substations caught fire and Heathrow Airport went dark. Could that happen to any of our UK air bases?
What I would say is the SDR has identified protection of our CNI as an area we need to do more in, and I think the lessons that we're seeking to learn from not just that incident but others that have happened more recently, Bryce Norton example, I think highlights that underinvestment over a long period of time has meant that there's greater vulnerabilities than I think we would want in the move to warfighting readiness. So part of the challenge that we need to grapple with ahead of the publication of the Defence Investment Plan later this year is how do we prioritise where the infrastructure investment needs to be able to meet some of those immediate challenges and the longer term ones. And certainly there is, I wouldn't be able to talk about single points of failure with any of our military infrastructure in front of the committee in open session, but certainly the intent of increasing our resilience as an integrated force is part of the wording and the spirit of the SDR that we are seeking to implement.
Okay. I don't know whether I can take from that whether you know the answer to the question I asked or not, but I just want to turn to Mr. Wyatt and ask a slightly different question in the context of defence reform, more muscular policy shop, a military execution arm, and the armaments director. If and bearing in mind the Minister said each part of the system plays its part and important that it plays its part and being trusted to play that part, I don't need to know the detail of everything the Department of Health are doing. So if after that incident the Minister were to come in to the department and say, Paul, can you go and check that, that this couldn't happen to any of our air bases? Under the new model, are you meant to say, do you know what, Minister, you need to put your long-handled screwdriver away? This is not a policy decision. It may be a political risk for you, but this is something that you need to let other people get on with. How's that model meant to work under the new system?
So in that example, and in any example where ministers have a request for information, then the responsibility of the department is to provide ministers with the evidence and the material they need to make decisions. In that particular example, the approach that we would take would be to work with colleagues in the military strategic headquarters to understand what the answer to that question is, and I think probably I would expect my MSHQ colleagues to be answering the ministerial question in that case, because it's a delivery question rather than a policy question, but we would work rapidly with them to make sure that we understood who was best placed to answer the question, and we would answer the question promptly.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. So I'm assuming that in due course we'll have the Minister for Defence Procurement before the committee, so that she could perhaps answer some of these questions that the committee has. Now, let me move on, Minister, to supply chain resilience. The Prime Minister noted on the floor of the House on the 26th of June that the nation needs to focus on resilience. I recently was representing the committee at the Globsec Forum in Prague, wherein we discussed critical raw materials. And I think you would agree with me that our ability to purchase, but also to ensure that there is a steady supply of critical raw materials and minerals is incredibly important. So why didn't the government feature this within the Strategic Defence Review?
So securing our supply lines and resilience is featured within the SDR. The spirit of what the SDR tells us is also important that we implement as well. So we're very mindful as a department that we need to look again at our resilience in the wider sense. That's what the SDR asks of us to do in terms of warfighting readiness, homeland defence, but also supply chain resilience. To do that, we need to work in partnership with industry to both understand their supply chains, the vulnerabilities within it, and we know that there are a number of areas where we've identified supply chain issues. If you look at the availability of energetics on the global stage, that is one of the areas we've identified as a problem, and that's why, as part of our commitment to build 6 new munitions factories, we include energetics within that. But we also have to be alive to the fact that onshoring and friendly shoring some of our supply chain is an important part of making sure that in a more contested time we can have greater resilience of our piece. Certainly the Minister of Defence Procurement Industry leads on that type of work, but I'm happy bringing Jim in, who also has that within his portfolio.
Mr. Carter?
Well, I think it is a really key part of the SDR. I think there are 16 recommendations that relate to this our supply chain, kind of a robust and resilient supply chain. And there's a critical program, the Defence Supply Chain Capability Program, and an element of that is specifically related to this supply chain risk. And in terms of our ability to kind of understand and illuminate deeper into the supply chain, but also working across government's departments to share that kind of intelligence, that's something we do quite actively.
Okay, my understanding was that this was mentioned, but there's a difference between mentioning something and it being an intrinsic and very much a focal part as a feature within the SDR. But all right, let me move on, Minister, just to say, how is the MOD working with other government departments to ensure that there is supply chain resilience in areas of critical importance, such as semiconductors, the critical minerals and steel? ADS, while giving evidence to our committee, noted that there are 15 key critical materials, and for 13 of those, China was very much the lead. So if they decided to pull the plug on that, our resilience and our ability would be significantly curtailed. So what steps is the government taking to ensure supply chain resilience with respect to that?
Chair, what I'd first of all just say is the Defence Industrial Strategy that will cover some of these points will be out later this year. And so not everything as we intend to publish was in the SDR, right, because there's elements of detail and focus on sectors that I think the Defence Industrial Strategy is probably the better place for that, and that will be featured as part of that. I mean, the SDR did absolutely recognise that resilience is a problem for both the UK military and for effectively our wider UK PLC. That's why we've taken the steps that I think Jim has just outlined to do more of that. There will be more parts of that within the defence industrial strategy as we look at how do we set a clearer demand signal to industry. And one of the demand signals we will be setting is not just say we want to procure this type of platform in the future, invest in these things, but also to be clear about the resilience of the industrial supply chain that we have an expectation that will follow for. But the detail of that, I'm afraid, would be best answered by Maria Eagle rather than myself.
Good. And just as a matter of clarification, Mr. Carter, I'm reliably informed by a committee specialist that I'm not going mad, in that there was only one recommendation within the SDR, and that was actually on the nuclear supply chain. And that's it. So, but I'm grateful, Minister, for your clarification that hopefully within the defence industrial strategy that these issues will be discussed, because at the moment we seem to be operating just-in-time deliveries, just-in-time financing and so on, and that isn't conducive to long-term planning. And we could really come a cropper if those issues aren't addressed. But I'm glad that there is going to be a focus on that. Let me also bring in Emma Liu on this issue as well.
Morning all. Just in relation to defence industry and supply chains, you'll all be aware that the Secretary of State at our meeting last week wouldn't commit to future order of typhoons, and that as of yesterday, existing orders at Wharton came to an end. So I'm just wondering, why was that not shared with this committee? Because the department must have known this last week. And are you not concerned for the loss of industrial skills, especially the knock-on for the GCAP programme?
So the procurement matters would be a matter for Maria Eagle, and so I wouldn't be able to answer in detail on that question. Certainly, preserving our capability to build high-end combat air platforms is absolutely essential to our national security. That is something I think everyone would agree on this in here, not just around how do we build Typhoons, but also how do we prepare for GCAP and the platforms that will come in the future. And so we do need to preserve that. Matters of what we are buying would be part of the Defence Investment Plan, which comes out later this year.
Existing orders came to an end yesterday, so all that skill set is now going to be lost, and we're part of the GCAP programme. How are we going to fill that gap, and why was this information not shared with this committee last week when we asked direct questions about it? Surely the department must have known that this was going to happen yesterday.
As that is a procurement matter, that's not within the area that I look after. So I'm happy asking the Minister of Defence, Procurement and Industry to write to the committee with the details, but I don't have the knowledge of that, as that's outside my swim lane.
And I suppose just for those workers there's some anger because it's seen as the decision to buy the F-35s may be seen as prioritising US workforce over UK workforce when we've made a great play about making sure that we build our own defence industrial base, and then a contract has been, issued to a foreign country, and people here are potentially losing their jobs.
I know the workforce, I know the supply chain, having met many, especially in opposition, when I covered more of that brief than I do today. They're superb, and it's certainly the reason why the Secretary of State and MinDPI have been working in this area. Probably worth saying that a Typhoon buy and F-35 buy are different platforms.
I know that, but it's the perception of the public, and if you're one of those people who works in defence industry and your job is on the line, how would you view it?
Well, I can absolutely understand where you're coming from, but it is worth saying that an F-35 is a different platform with different roles than a Typhoon. But certainly, the SDR makes clear our commitment to GCAP. But on the details of that point, I'll have to write to the committee or ask Maria to do so.
Okay.
Good. And as I mentioned earlier, we do need somebody, in particular the Minister, to be able to answer those questions. So perhaps you could take that message back as well, because I think it's definitely long overdue that we have the Minister to answer all of these questions, given the strength of feeling as you will have ascertained. Right, let me move on to Lincoln Jopp, please.
One of the recommendations in this Strategic Defence Review was for in further investment into an integrated air and missile defence system for the United Kingdom. You're going to, obviously, the defence investment strategy is going to cover the detail of that, but could you just give us, in policy terms, a sense of any capability choices that you are pursuing or have ruled out? And the second policy question is, is your policy assumption that UK's overseas territories will be covered by said capability?
Entirely fair question. So the Defence Investment Plan later this year will set out what we're buying and what our long-term signal to the sector is. But we've been very clear that we want to invest more in integrated air missile defence. That's why the SDR not only sets that as a priority, but also allocates £1 billion, I think it is, against that project. I think in terms of what that is seeking to do, to answer your question, first of all, it's the ability to detect missiles and one-way effectors earlier, which is something that is an integral part of understanding how you defeat it, to be able to detect it early. Secondly, it's how do we work with our, in particular, NATO allies to be able to get there, because although it is possible for a missile or one-way effector to arrive in the UK mainland from any compass point going, the predominant threat risk from that type of angles will come from certain approaches. So understanding how do we work with our NATO allies in order to detect and to defeat those is an important part of that. Investing in then the capabilities of what other capabilities that we would need in order to do that. So the SDR sets out our commitment to have Dragonfire, our directed energy weapon system, brought into service and on 4 of our 6 Royal Navy destroyers as operational platforms, I think by 2027, I think what the SDR set out. That is a really important part of testing new technologies to be able to defeat the threats that we're facing, but also looking at what are the other aspects of what is a layered integrated air missile defence would need to look like. Your question about overseas territories, as someone who, both myself and the Minister for Overseas Territories, if you were to do a league table of the biggest nerds on OTs, it would probably be me and him towards the top of it. So it is certainly something that Stephen Doughty and myself spend a lot of time talking about in terms of the security relationship. And you may know that as part of the OT work that the FCDO leads on, with the cross-government board, there's now a security board that sits underneath that, that myself and Stephen Doughty and a number of other ministers sit on, that look at the security arrangements for our overseas territories. There's less of a missile risk for many of those, and so it's about other aspects of security. But if you look at the system that we have in the Falklands, for instance, at the moment, which is probably the overseas territory that has the immediate aerial risk to it, our commitment to maintain that there is long established, and what is certainly true is that we probably don't have enough systems, which is what the SDR identifies as us need to invest further in integrated air missile defence. And also the Skysaber system there is very good, and the people that are working on it are excellent. We have not as many of those platforms as I think I would like, and that's why the focus on the SDR to look at integrated air missile defence is important. And if I was to relate that back to the wider inquiry that you're looking at, how do we do that alongside our NATO allies, for instance? And that's where the UK's work on the Diamond Initiative, for instance, the kind of NATO, cross-NATO integrated air missile defence initiative, I think is a really important part of that, because what we need to make sure is that any system or operation that we choose to adopt in the UK is fully integrated as part of that wider NATO approach. Because for most missiles, if they were to get to the UK, in terms of a risk from a Russian platform, for instance, they would probably fly through NATO airspace on other member states before they reach us. So how do we defeat them, detect them, and create that layered approach? And if we're looking at the experience of Ukraine in respect to that, it's not just... I'm guilty of using the shorthand missile defence just there, but it's also about how we look at ballistic missile threat, cruise missile threats, and one-way effectors and drones in particular. And that's why I would kind of encourage the committee, when they're looking at that, to understand or to have a view of the wider layered approach that we need to adopt, and that will be capabilities on the UK Homeland, but capabilities that are deployable and capabilities that we work in conjunction with our partners, including those that may be forward deployed, and that could include, for instance, combat air and the ability for Typhoons to shoot down missiles in flight, for instance. But as we are seeing more drone warfare and more greater severe impacts of Russian drone warfare and how Ukrainians use drones as part of their defence of their country, our wider air defence picture needs not just be about ballistic missiles and the cruise missiles, it needs to be about the wider swarm drone effects. And so there's plenty in that area we need to get at, but I'm really pleased that it got a good mention and funding allocated to it in the SDR.
It's just worth, we had an evidence session with Professor Peter Roberts from Exeter University, who said that kind of entry level, you're talking about 20 billion. And obviously that's iterative, because move creates counter move, creates counter move, and it's a dialectic. And so it's important that we're getting into this business, but like so many of these things, it does have the ability to swallow up all the defence expenditure alongside CASD, and everything else can go hang.
Well, I mean, the Defence Investment Plan will set out the spending priorities, and certainly we need to be on a journey towards having an integrated air missile defence at a level that we can have more confidence in, based on the experience we can see Russia using. What I would say is, part of that, we need to square a circle of how we use what can be incredibly expensive missiles to shoot down what are relatively inexpensive one-way effectors. And so the economic dynamics of this has fundamentally changed, as we are seeing in Ukraine. And that's partly why the tactics are evolving so quickly in Ukraine. So using drones that are designed to intercept other drones is a really important part of that. And we can see that as part of the iterative effect of drone warfare, which, you'll know from your experience, but changes every 2 to 3 weeks in Ukraine due to the complexities of the EW jammed environment. And what I want to make sure is that the system we buy into and the modus operandi we buy into can be scalable and have spiral development, because that is much more agile and innovative sector than some perhaps other parts of our deterrent picture.
I think it's probably just for the chair. I think it's probably just worth reinforcing that we do have effectors now in service that can defeat. So as the Minister said, this is about strengthening, detect and track. This is about broadening our ability to engage. And to your point on cost, it's very much about partnering.
Good, thank you very much. I'm mindful of the fact that we've only got about half an hour left. There are 5 areas still to cover that the committee would like evidence on to help the formulation of our report. I know that members will be mindful of that fact, including our panellists in their responses, so that approximately 5 to 6 minutes on each area should ensure that we get all the evidence and we finish on time. Now, to highlight and be an excellent example of this, let me pass on to Mike Martin, please.
So I'd like to ask some questions about inflation, defence inflation. Perhaps, Mr. Carter, if I could just come straight to you. We're entering an era of spending more money on defence, not just the UK, but our allies as well. If we don't have increased capacity, the right financial structures, etc., then that creates inflation, and we've seen this. The cost of a 155 shell to Ukraine has sort of doubled over the course of the war. So, Mr. Carter, could you speak to? I think there's probably 2 sides to that I'd like you to speak to. One is consistent demand signals to industry, and how we're coordinating those with our European partners, because we're all buying off the same firms, more or less. And then the other side of it, which is financial structures and what we're doing to create the right investment and perhaps credit market for our suppliers. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there are 3 key elements that can help suppress inflation, and that's about matching that supply growth with that demand growth. I think you mentioned that demand signal. That's an absolutely key part. I think it's going to be set out in sort of 3 ways. The SDR sets out some of that commitments. For example, the 6 billion commitment on munitions. The Defence Industrial Strategy will follow shortly and set out a lot of our strategic priorities. And then the third element is around that, the Defence Investment Plan. I think acquisition reform, though, which comes out strongly in the SDR, is critical to this as well, in terms of accelerating the system, getting to contract quicker and pulling through that capability, and an important role actually of UK defence innovation here as well, in terms of pulling through that technology. In terms of the the financial structures.
I just pick up on one point that you just said there. How do we not make the mistakes we've made before? Because probably if we were sitting in this committee hearing 10 years ago, we'd have said the same things about consistent demand signals to industry. How would you characterise the mistakes we made previously around designing something and then industry starting to build it, then us redesigning it and then scoping it, and all? How do we not make those same mistakes again?
I think some of the changes in defence reform help there, in terms of that structure under the Quad, clearer accountabilities and a clearer demand signal coming into the National Armaments Director Group. And I do think, I recognise that some of these things will have been said before. I do think the stars are aligning in terms of some of the changes we're seeking to make, in terms of that increase in defence spending, and a real appetite. When I talk to industry, there's a real appetite to sort of get after some of these targets that we've set out in the SDR. I think in terms of the financial structures and attracting investment, the SDR sets out that we'll have a financial services strategy, and we're going to establish a defence investment advisory group. And in fact, I think today, as we speak, there's the Chancellor and Secretary of State together.
Who's going to sit on that defence investment advisory group?
I think that's that is being sort of decided as we speak. But I think so. I think there's a lot of effort. It's set out in the SDR. This Defence Economic Growth Task Force report is launched today. That will set out a number of recommendations that we need to implement. But I also think the changes we're making to the acquisition cycle make defence an even more attractive opportunity for investment, because investors are getting the returns on their investment quicker because of that pull-through and capability. And it is a radical, what we're talking about is radical in terms of that acceleration. So the SDR sets out, and this is one of the metrics that perhaps we could have put in earlier, that 6 years to 2 years for major modular platforms, 3 years to 1 year for spiral and model development, and then 3 months for commercial exploitation, and that's kind of bottom tier. That is profoundly quicker, and obviously will give that return that I mentioned.
And then just coordination with European allies and other allies? Because their spending's going up as well. We're going to be buying off many of the same firms. Are we trying to get ahead of that curve so that we speak with one voice?
If I can answer that one, the answer is yes. And so both in the Trinity House agreement with Germany, the refresh with Lancaster House that is ongoing, and also the agreements we're looking to strike with Norway and Poland, there's opportunities of joint development. Certainly one of the pieces that we need to be very mindful of is, in the past, UK Defence has had a siloed approach because they haven't, each service effectively buying separately. Now CDS commands all of those three services. We expect an integration, but we also have an approach
You've got one investment plan.
But we also have an approach whereby saying we need to have greater interoperability with our kit. We need to have a built-in assumption of exports for the stuff that we are buying. And so that means not over-speccing UK kit to be Gucci for ourselves, but to have it exportable. Now, that was, I don't think, a sense that was always carried through in previous procurement campaigns, shall I say, on some of our platforms. That needs to be the default from now on, because we need to be able to have the ability to build more, export more, get a greater benefit from that increased defence spending, but also have the interoperability benefits that come from many of our partner nations operating similar platforms to ourselves.
I'm going to if I just make a comment, then I'll hand back to the chair if that's right. Can I suggest perhaps that when you talk about European partners and you list a series of bilateral arrangements, that perhaps we need to do a larger scale, more multilateral coordination around how we are going to coordinate that, because all of this money is going to flood into the marketplace, and if it's not coordinated, it's going to create a very confused picture, and that might lead to defence inflation.
I would say, sorry to reply to your comment, is effectively one of the bits that NATO is very good at but doesn't often get the attention to, that we're putting more effort into, is the coordination of the National Armaments Directors, and more of a role there, and indeed how we play into some of those European initiatives that we've now opened the door to, because I think what you have said is entirely right. We do need to work with the greater procurement, but also the bilateral and minilateral arrangements provide opportunities for doing that as well.
It saves us money if we get it right.
Absolutely.
Just to build on what Mike Martin has just been saying, that while there's going to be a significant increase in defence spending, the committee is very much focused on ensuring that there is value for money. And I hope that the government focuses in on this and that it doesn't just lead to a much greater profitability for defence firms and the British taxpayer is not getting bang for buck. But no doubt we will be revisiting this. But very briefly, Minister, given that this would only be one of a suite of measures, why has the government not backed the Defence Security and Resilience Bank?
The initiative that's one of many initiatives in this space that actually we're quite excited about, because there is a real opportunity, I think, when it comes to multilateral financing for some of these opportunities to look at what's the right model. Both the Treasury and the MOD are working to look at those. There's a number of the models that have been backed not only on a multinational basis but also by some very senior former British military figures. Indeed, there's a number of those that are competing with each other. Our job, I think, is to listen, engage. We get the value of it. We want to do it. We need to reduce the options to the ones that can deliver the most and can be supported as much as possible on a multinational basis.
Good. Thank you for that clarification, because we have looked into that issue. On to Richard Ford, please.
Thank you, Chair. And since you last appeared in front of the Defence Committee, Minister, the UK has agreed a Defence and Security Memorandum of Understanding with the European Union, and the UK is seeking access to the SAFE programme. How can the UK shape this programme, given that we're outside the European Union?
The progress that we've been making with the European EU reset, I think, is most acutely, the benefits most acutely felt in defence, and that's why it had such a large part of the security and defence partnership work that benefits us. The agreement that we've made with the European Union does not put us into SAFE at this point, as an example, but it opens the door for those negotiations to take place. And so we're now in discussions around that, and indeed, as we are on some other elements of using the kind of European infrastructure to look at how we can participate. Participation needs to be in the UK's interest, and it needs to be affordable for the taxpayer and all the other conditions as you would expect. But what we have done now is got the door open. And what we now need to do is continue those conversations. But getting the door open in the first place was a really big step forwards. And now it has happened. I think it provides the opportunity for us to explore what's in the UK's best national interest to participate in those projects. Certainly, we know that from a member state point of view, there's a lot of EU member states that are very, very keen on UK participation in a number of programmes, want to see that happen. Clearly, we need to...
Some that aren't as well, perhaps.
Well, I think actually there's strong support for us to be involved. I think there's a question about which programmes do we feel there's a benefit for ourselves to be involved with, and how much do we want to contribute and commit in there. That's usual discussions. I don't think there's anything different about any of those discussions that we would normally have. How we influence those is by effectively being part of them if we are, being clear about the objectives. But for many of those European programmes, we're not alone in wanting them entirely aligned with the NATO approach, and we, alongside many of those EU member states, are on the same page when it comes to that. But clearly the opportunity is now available to us to have those discussions, and we're undertaking that work.
And I'd highlight the recent EU paper, the Defence and Security White Paper, which was very clear that the EU is seeking to meet NATO capability targets and NATO force targets. So the EU endeavour is very much focused on NATO, something that we very much support.
And the United States won't be part of the SAFE programme, we suppose. Are there implications there for the UK?
So as a leading NATO nation, we need to cooperate both with our European friends and our transatlantic ones. And so that would be pretty established as we develop capabilities and export kit and equipment across the NATO alliance and further afield.
Up to €600 billion. That's going to make a difference to UK-US relations, isn't it?
I think the Americans are very keen for Europe to step up. And I think I've heard that message clearly. I think many of our European allies have as well. In stepping up, that means doing more. And doing more has an industrial focus, it has a military focus, but that is entirely where the US wants Europe to be. We've heard that. We are stepping up more as a country in terms of defence spending, in terms of our UK leadership, and in terms of our operational availabilities. But the door's been open to those discussions now. I can't preempt what the outcome would be of those, but having those discussions and the ability to have those discussions is a substantial step forward that we did not have until the Security and Defence Partnership was signed by the Prime Minister.
Thank you very much. Alex Baker, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the panels for your contribution so far. I was really pleased to see in the SDR a real focus turbocharging the organisation within the MOD, and this approach, this segmented approach set out to planning and delivery by domain, threat and by industrial need. Has this been put into practice yet?
So we are implementing the SDR at the moment. When it comes to the procurement side of things, the biggest changes I think the committee will be able to see is when the industrial strategy, defence industrial strategy is published, and then when it's put into practice in terms of effectively the kit and equipment, the infrastructure that we are seeking to spend that increased defence budget on. And certainly some of the changes that we have sought to make, not just from implementing the SDR, but in defence reform that the Secretary of State announced early on in his tenure in the role, has seen improvements in the way that the DE&S, the NAD group, in terms of the defence reform terminology, has been able to deploy. And certainly the lessons learned from our procurement on Ukrainian gear being mapped over. Now, not all those lessons are directly applicable. We're not buying frigates in the same way, but certainly if you look at some of the support for drones, one-way effectors, some of the ammunition and platforms that we are now able to buy for Ukraine at such a fast rate, with spiral development built in, that should give us confidence that the ambition that we have on the segmentation that Jim spoke about in terms of the reduction of the contracting time in particular, the clearer demand signal for industry to be able to invest, and the clearer export opportunities that will arise from that, I think are all positive. But I think the committee will be able to see that most illustrated when the Defence Industrial Strategy comes out.
So I'm also really excited about the SME support hub. I think it's a really welcome step. How will this hub help smaller firms get through those procurement hurdles and bring innovation into service faster?
So I think a key part of that lower segmentation point actually is critical for SMEs. So, and you mentioned, as you say, the kind of the SME support centre, and also that'll be followed up with an SME action plan. I think the pace of acquisition for SMEs is critical. So, before we took a bit of a one approach, being really clear about the pace with which we're trying to get through that process. The SDR set out that we're going to rationalise some of our defence conditions and defence standards as well, which can be quite difficult to navigate for SMEs, and all of that helps them accelerate. I think actually how sort of SMEs and that kind of those innovative ideas that are so critical to our capability are also going to be coming through the sort of UK defence innovation, and how the SME support centre and UK defence innovation work together, and they are working very closely together to make that a sort of seamless experience for SMEs is going to be key, I think.
I would further just add the target on direct spend with SMEs I think is really important, and I know that there's a number of members on committee here who are really championing the involvement of SMEs in the defence space. We're really keen to pursue that, and certainly the objectives that were set out in the SDR, the sense of that this government has, and what will be in the Defence Industrial Strategy, needs to be about having more direct spend with SMEs, having a greater backing of the innovation and ingenuity, and then being able to apply that to export arrangements at the same time. And that's where some of the investment decisions that we can take via the national security investment organisations that we share with some of our friends across government can make a big difference.
One of the conversations that has pained me most over the 6 months I've been working, really looking at these issues, is where I find defence SMEs telling me that they have gone to the US for their VC because they cannot get the cash to be able to grow their business in the UK. They're then being bought up, and we then lose all of that IP. How is the department tracking this? Somebody needs to be monitoring it, I feel. How is that being looked at?
Well said. I will ask Maria Eagle to write in detail on that point, but certainly the implementation of the financial services strategy that we seek to make seeks to recognise the difficulties that some firms have in terms of raising investment, and certainly dealing with some of the valleys of death in terms of the investment bringing a product to market and then achieving the investment in purchasing or the sales of that technology, whatever it may be. So there's a number of areas where we are planning to undertake work on. The defence reform work around the National Armaments Director creates a single responsibility for this within defence. So that helps us to be able to have a clearer sense within defence of responsibilities in this area, but the drive to spend more directly with SMEs to back more of our smaller firms is really important. But I think we are alive to the situation that you speak about around the availability and the development potential elsewhere within the NATO alliance. And although for many companies that may be a good thing, I think there is a strategic objective for us to preserve more of that within the UK, and that's what the Defence Industrial Strategy will seek to do.
Very briefly, Mr. Carter, very briefly.
Well, if I just add to the Minister's comment. So there's something about putting the money where the math is. So 400 million ring-fenced in UK defence innovation, and up to 10% of the equipment plan on these kind of novel technologies. So I think that there's a real appetite to do that. And the SDR also sets out a kind of review of our the IP handling as well, to make sure that we drive those home.
Good, thank you. A very short, sharp intervention by Lincoln Job.
Mr. Ream's not in his place, but he told a horror story of an SME in his constituency who were on a down select to a prime from 8 to 7, and they were being charged $100,000 to do the testing for that down select. So leave aside the fact that a down select from 8 to 7 is not a down select. Surely the National Armaments Director has got to be empowered at this point of maximum potential to reach down the throats of the 18 primes and change their behaviours on the basis that we haven't nationalised them for the last 60 years.
So I would say, the support that our primes give to SMEs, their approach to SMEs is a critical part. So we both have to have our direct work with SMEs working really well, being a kind of someone that small businesses like working with, enjoy working with, find it easy. But as critically is are the primes. I mean, I'm not aware of the specific example you give. I do think that the what's also been stood up under the SDR, which is this Defence Industrial Joint Council, which the Secretary of State launched last month, is a great opportunity to engage with industry and to sort of drive home some of those important points that you make.
Thank you very much. Emily, please.
Again. The Defence Industrial Strategy, the government have said that its ambition is to have growth deals right across the UK. Can I just ask, will they be in every single region, those defence growth deals?
So that's an area that Maria Eagle is working in, and so I don't want to steal her sandwiches to be able to pre-announce anything on there. But certainly the intention that the Secretary of State has laid out quite clearly is to have more investment reaching our regions, and so 68% of defence spending is outside London and the South East at the moment. We want to see that further increase, and if you look at the investment decisions we've already been making as a government, nearly every single one of those has been outside. Many of those, the investment in Barrow, the nuclear reactors in Derby, for instance, and so there's more opportunity, more scope to do that, and that is where I think I'm looking forward to the Defence Industrial Strategy being able to set that clearer demand signal, not just for industry to invest, but also, I mentioned it earlier, we need to get more skills into this sector. And to do that, we need to get the local skills ecosystems investing. That means primes investing more in skills, not just for their own business, but for their supply chain and the locality. And to do that, more certainty of investment is a key part of that, and that's what hopefully the industrial strategy will set out.
This might be another one for your colleague as well, but the MOD, as we know, isn't comfortable with rapid change, risk or experimentation or that fast fail kind of environment that you would have with some startups and tech companies. So what are you doing to improve conditions for them to grow and thrive throughout the UK so they don't all leave us and go elsewhere?
Yeah, I think the critique you mentioned is valid when it looks at the big procurements, but actually we can show fast fail works incredibly well in our support for Ukraine. So it is not that this cannot be done, it's that it has not been done. The cultural incentives, the bureaucratic incentives were not pointing in the right direction for that wider procurement. As someone who looks after Ukraine procurement rather than UK procurement, I can say that we are operating in that environment very consistently for the equipment that we support our Ukrainian friends with. So we've got experience of that. That's why the section on the in the SDR where we're learning lessons from Ukraine is not just about how does drone warfare change where you put your troops in terms of a combat situation. It's about how we procure, how we supply, how we iterative develop, how we use data, and the movement towards some of those single digital backbones, for instance, are a really important part of learning from that, and that's where some of the fast fail environment has worked. Our job now, I think, is to translate some of those lessons where applicable to the wider procurement environment and the segmentation approach, the faster delivery, the moving away from over-speccing UK stuff. I think all of that fits into the environment where you allow platforms to have spiral development built in rather than spiral development being a painful process that by the time the spiral development kicks in, that technology can already be out of date. That's what we want to avoid.
Have you seen it in your short time in Postminster, have you seen a cultural change within the MOD more towards that?
So I'm seeing the process, yeah. And so the process of cultural change is both in terms of the defence reform work, having shaken up the organisation in terms of separating and being clear about the new responsibilities against the Department of State, MSHQ, NAD Group, and the Defence Nuclear Enterprise. So that is creating cultural change within it. I think it is fair to say that across the wider look of defence, we need to be able to translate that not just at senior levels, but to the operational level. That's why I think being very clear from the get-go about our expectation of time improvements, what we're seeking to deliver, so no one that works in defence, whether they work in uniform, in a civilian role or in industry, can be in any doubt about the direction of travel. That I think is an important messaging scene that we've seen. But I think there's still more work to do as we seek to not only complete defence reform, but also implement the SDR, which includes quite a lot of fundamental changes in practices and behaviours. But a key part of that is changing the incentives within our system that previously might have moved towards risk aversion, towards over complexity, and we need to remove those if we are to achieve the warfighting readiness objective that the SDR sets out.
Well, just another very quick one from me. Sorry, Chair, I know time's getting on. But we've talked about these issues quite a lot in committee and in the previous iteration of the committee before the general election. And we keep getting told, there's plans in place, things are changing. When do you think startups will be able to come to us and say it actually has changed and we're able to get on with getting contracts and getting the work we need?
Well, I hope they're already saying that in relation to Ukraine procurement, because we work enormously with SMEs in that space, and so I think they should be able to see that, although that is a story that is, for very obvious reasons, harder to tell. But when the SME support hub is at full operating capacity, when it comes out of the industrial strategy, there's quite a lot of significant change that I'm aware of, and I know that Maria Eagle, and I get the impression that I'll be encouraging her to sit in this spot in front of the committee in due course, will be able to expand more details. That's an area that she leads on.
All right, I'll leave it there, Chair.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Alex Baker, please.
Thank you, Chair. Just to finish off on defence finance. So, every week I have an SME contact me with either a banking issue or an HMRC issue. This is a very real and difficult times for SMEs within the sector. The FS sector are very clear there is not an issue. The defence sector are very clear there is an issue. But there is clearly issues there that need to be addressed. Luke Charters and I did a report on rewiring defence finance, where we recommended that there needed to be much more invested approach to communication between HMT, MOD and DBT on these issues. How is that approach going? How are those conversations going between those departments?
Well, first thing I say, the work that you've done with Luke Charters has been outstanding. And it's a really good example of how really constructive challenge can create change. So it is something that has certainly gripped the MOD and Treasury. And one of the objectives that the Secretary of State and the team had when we came into office was to basically build a better relationship between the MOD and Treasury in particular. That was not there when we took over, and I think we benefit from a better relationship in looking at that. But also, I think it is a better relationship in terms of raising the challenges that the defence sector faces. So on the analogy split between whether the financial services industry or the defence industry are right, I recognise this as the lived experience of defence industries, especially around ESG, access to finance and others. That needs to change. It needs to change if we are to achieve the SDR objectives. It needs to change if we are to value those people that are looking to innovate in this area in particular. So there's lots of work that needs to happen there. Those discussions are happening with HMT colleagues in particular, because I think the majority of the issues come from a regulatory, or a lever could be a regulatory response, and that is held by the HMT. And those conversations are productive. I want to see more happen there, and I would kind of encourage both the committee to wholesalely adopt the approach that you're arguing for, but also to make sure that this argument is not held only within the defence realm. Because I think, it speaks to a whole of society approach, but for defence to achieve our objectives of national security and national resilience in a changing time, yes, defence has to change, but we need the rest of government to recognise that. And certainly I've seen that a lot more in terms of our cross-government interactions than I witnessed when I was in opposition, looking at the how different parts of government are working together. I still think there's a lot more that needs to be done here, and I think some of the recommendations of your report are being looked at very closely by especially Treasury colleagues, and I know there's more that we want to do in this area.
Great, that's good to hear. I think another focus for me would be with HMRC. A lot of SMEs are getting caught up, tied in knots with HMRC because of MOD procurement cycles. So I think that has got to be a real focus. Companies being dissolved, or at risk of being dissolved because they haven't been able to get the cash through procurement cycles to be able to pay their tax bill. I would say that needs to be a focus. I'm also just coming back to this primes issue. I mean, I am still getting companies telling me, I was with a company in my constituency, I think a tier 2 supplier who is on 120-day payment terms. What are we going to do about this?
Across the board, we've been clear right from the start that we want to reduce the payment terms for SMEs. That was an early announcement that I think the Treasury made in the first few weeks of coming to office. That needs to be implemented. I want to see clearer, easier payment terms that support SMEs in relation to this. And I know that it's something that Maria Eagle feels strongly about as well. If you're able to share that specific example with the Minister, with Maria Eagle, I'm certain that it helps our arguments no end by having the examples that demonstrate that we still need to do more in this respect.
Yeah. And then coming back to actually the wider sort of ESG issue and beyond finance, SC Group, Supercat down in your part of the world, Minister, have spoken publicly about actually how they have had their website taken off them because their provider went for B Corp status. And they achieved B Corp status, and suddenly their website, they were like, we can't provide your website anymore, you're a defence company. What is your message to B Corp?
Well, securing our national security is a job of everybody. It is absolutely right that those industries, big and small, that contribute to our national security in these heightened risk times are supported and valued by the whole of society. And certainly knowing Supercat, who are involved in the production of the Jackal 3, which is built actually in the constituency that I represent. They're a great firm. They're doing really innovative stuff. They have a focus on local suppliers, which I think is incredibly admirable and could be adopted by more companies. It is precisely organisations like that we as a society should be backing. And I think looking at how we can make a stronger argument for that, so ESG implications are not just about access to finance, de-banking, availability of loans and support, but can speak to the wider role that defence industry can play. The government's absolutely clear on this. We need to invest more in our UK firms. We need them to be valued more, and that's when we're talking about a whole of society approach. That's not just defence looking at a whole of society approach. That means the whole of society having greater visibility of all the roles that they can play in our national defence and supporting SMEs that are often creating good, decent jobs in our regions is an important part of how we create that added resilience and that added national security that we need at this time of threat. And so I hope that firms can clearly hear the support their government's offering, and the Defence Industrial Strategy will hopefully set out more about what we intend to do in that area in due course.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you very much. And Minister, just to conclude the session, I just wanted to confirm that during today's hearing, you mentioned that there will be certain things that you will be writing to us on. There are also other areas where we need further information. So if our committee team were to write latest by the early part of next week with all those various requests on one list, can you please assure us that there will be a response forthcoming by the latest 27th of August in order that we can then incorporate all of those things within our final report, please?
Yep, happy doing that. I'm aware that the government evidence of this was submitted 6 months ago, and so the world has changed quite considerably in the last 6 months, as has government policy. So happy receiving that, and I'll undertake to get a good response back to you.
Thank you, Raj. I thank you for that undertaking, and also Minister, Director Generals, Air Vice Marshal, thank you so much for your time, and I am in no doubt that that will significantly enhance our final recommendations and the report, which will be going out to yourself very soon. And with that, I bring today's Defence Committee evidence session on UK's contribution to European security to a close. Order.